All right, let's wrap up economic systems and outcomes in this video. And we left off talking about evaluating performance in a economy. So we do this by applying the weights to the outcomes. For example, different nations may have different economic goals and therefore weigh economic outcomes differently. Economic growth may be less valued in Islamic versus Western countries. Income equality may be more important to Denmark than to China. These goals are shaped by culture, values, theology, philosophy. If we are scientists in economics, our role is to find out what matters to that country and then provide a prescription for achieving those outcomes. So as an economist, if a country says, we would like to have more equity in our outcome, like Denmark has, the economist would come along and say, okay, that's doable. You can use government as a means of redistribution, raise your taxes, create all sorts of social programs that transfer money from the higher income groups to the lower income groups. But there is a trade-off that is likely to show up in terms of your economic growth rates, in terms of the real GDP per capita. It's the economist's role to lay out the benefits and costs so that the leaders and people in charge of making these decisions can make good decisions, okay? We're not here as scientists to say whether a particular outcome and weight is good or bad. It's a matter of judgment and subjectivity that science tries not to involve itself in. Now, make no mistake, that doesn't mean you can't have your opinions on the side, but as an economist, as a scientist, we're here to evaluate objectively these kinds of things. All societies face trade-offs when pursuing outcomes and must consider the cost-benefit calculation to make the optimal decisions. Take a look at this illustration down here. We've got various parts of the world represented by the dots. On the vertical axis, we have the presence of effective democracy from 2000 to 2002. So that would be a particular institution, right? Political institution, democracy, and a higher number would be more democracy, full, and a lower number would be less democracy, all the way to none. And then on the horizontal axis, we put the support for democracy in the mid-90s. And it could be instrumental on one extreme or intrinsic on another. Another way to think about these terms is the emotional attachment involved. When something is instrumental, there's not much emotion attached to it. It's an implement, a means to an end. Whereas when something is intrinsic, there is a lot of emotion attached to it. It's personal. It matters deeply to the individual's value system and moral fabric. Another word for instrumental, by the way, would be extrinsic. So you can think of extrinsic versus intrinsic. Regardless, in countries that had intrinsic support for democracy in the mid-90s, they were much more likely to have effective democracy in the 2000s. See this? So Protestant Europe, English speaking. And then countries that had more instrumental, extrinsic support for democracy in the 90s, it was just a means to an end, they were less likely to have that in the 2000s, right? Sub-Saharan Africa and Islamic Orthodox, these regions of the world. This is very telling because it suggests that when support for a particular institution like democracy is personal, it's more likely to occur. And if we look across the globe at many of the uprisings that have emerged to try to cultivate democracy over totalitarianism, some have succeeded, some have failed. And you'll find that the ones that have failed oftentimes didn't have that emotion, that personal element to it. The best example for someone in America, of course, is the Revolutionary War, where you had this ad hoc military kind of throwing together very limited training take on the largest military in the world. And you know, there's many factors that come into play here, obviously, but there had to be a passion to see that revolutionary war through. Today, what we see in Hong Kong is quite passionate, quite intrinsic, because the Hong Kongers have had democracy for a long time. They become accustomed to having personal freedom and a say in their government, and that's changing for them. So you're seeing a lot of protests, uprisings, and so forth. Only time will tell if it effectively coalesces into a return of democracy at the level they had before. Right now, it's too soon to tell. Okay. And again, here we're just focused on democracy, but that's one institution. There's many others. I mean, if a country feels very passionate about freedom of speech, then you're more likely to see freedom of speech in that country in the future. If a country feels very passionate about having universal health care, then that country is more likely to have universal health care in the future. And this passion, this intrinsic valuation of the various institutions comes from the people, from the masses, not necessarily from the government. So a government could come along and say, well, we value having high levels of economic growth. We're going to put a lot of weight on that outcome. And the people say, no, we value equity more. So what ends up happening in that country is they have a hard time growing because the people are resisting the government's attempt to grow the economy. Okay? That's where power comes into play. It would be much easier for a government that puts a high weight on a particular outcome to get that done if they have control over all aspects of that economy, like we might see in China. It'd be much harder for the government to dictate the outcomes and the weights applied if it's a democracy where the people have a lot more influence. Okay, but personal makes it more likely to occur. Finally, let's wrap up with this illustration here. And it's a little bit hard to read, but it is in your book. I just wanted to copy it here so we could talk about it. The data looks at various countries and their national priorities. For example, the black bars say there is too much difference between the rich and the poor. Okay, so income inequality would be a national priority. And look where that's the highest. It's really high in France, it's high in India, Philippines, Brazil, and the US. Well, when it comes to all of these, with the exception of France, we do have a lot of difference between the rich and the poor. There is a lot of income inequality. So that might be why it's prioritized. With France, it's just been long a historical value. And then law, order, and morality are too lax. This is kind of a measurement of corruption. And you'll notice that that's highest in India. And that makes sense because India has long battled the image of corrupt governments. And then social welfare for the poor and handicapped is inadequate. This is more pronounced in Japan, the US, and it looks like Australia. Okay. Well, part of that might be related to the level of abundance in those countries. When you have countries that are prosperous, high income countries, they're more likely to emphasize the welfare of the poor and the handicapped. Okay. And then finally, people are not concerned enough about the environment. That one is highest in the US, Germany, Switzerland, and Australia. Okay. That also fits with prosperity. People tend to be more concerned about things like the environment when they've already satisfied a lot of other needs. In other words, you'll notice that the lowest levels of concern would be in countries like India, right? And the Philippines, much poorer environments where that's just not on their radar right now. Their concerns are, things like income inequality, corruption. But that can change as they become more abundant. All right, so this helps us understand how different countries are going to apply different weights to the outcomes that they pursue. And it is the economist's goal to help those leaders make good decisions, understanding the trade-offs that they face in the process. All right, that's it, guys. If you have questions, let me know. Thanks.